It's the Real Estate Podcast, brought to you by ANZ Home Loans for financial well-beings.
The last 5 years in particular, what property has done from a value creation, wealth creation perspective in Australia and Southeast Queensland has been, far better than we ever could have forecast as a couple to allow us to do this.
And that is Jacob Aldridge on the Real Estate Breakfast this morning on another Friday that is rocked into town. It is another busy property search probably for you coming up this weekend. And there is that thought going around so close to Christmas with so many Aussie families saying to themselves this question: can we be in our new home before Christmas? Of course you can. We get that. The meter is running. Spring is underway, so let's go for that sprint of open homes and auctions coming up in the next couple of days. As mentioned, it is a Friday, September the 12th. Domain. Now, they ran an interesting story about how just at 20 years old, Kate chose travel over buying her first property. And interestingly enough, that was shaped by watching her parents struggle with their mortgage. She spent years exploring the world, but at 41 has finally bought her first property in Sydney, wishing that somebody had shown her that she could have done both travel and home ownership. By contrast, Jacob Aldridge, at 21 years of age, learned that he could buy in Brisbane, but only by giving up overseas travel. Two very different choices, both highlighting the trade-off young buyers face right now between freedom and financial security later. So let's right now catch up with Jacob Aldridge, and to prove a point about travelling, he is in Tunisia. And good morning to you, Jacob. Welcome into the Real Estate Breakfast. I have to say, I know very little about Tunisia.
Good morning. It's a country I knew very little about before we made the decision to come here. We are full-time travellers now. We aim to spend time in 6 to 10 countries a year. There are some restrictions around how long you can spend in certain areas, like the Schengen zone in Europe. So we were looking for a summer location, and Tunisia came up as an opportunity. We booked an excellent home that we're staying in for a few months, and we didn't know very much beforehand. We've learned so much being here around the history of this country, Carthage, ancient Rome, a lot of civilizations, and a really beautiful country right at the tip of North Africa. That's been a wonderful experience that we've been able to have here, and world schooling our daughter, which we do as part of the travel, for her to be able to go and walk amongst 2,500-year-old ruins and learn that way is, I think, so much better than what she would have been. And our experience is that most people, most countries are very, very welcoming of anyone who can come and be respectful, and that's why we want to go. We want to go and experience different cultures, different people, and to respect what we're there for rather than perhaps being some of the ugly cliches of tourists around the world that people fear.
Now, we were talking about Kate, whose situation completely different to yours. Well, yes, she's doing the travel side, but she didn't get into home ownership. I just wonder, your friends who took off travelling didn't get into property ownership. Now you're in your 40s. What has some of the reaction been to you doing this travelling? And how long have you had your property? Almost 20 years or over 20 years, is it?
Well, yes, I bought my first unit at 21, so over 20 years ago now, 22 years ago that I bought that, and very much embraced the property ladder opportunity. Sold that, bought a house with my then girlfriend, the house we had when we were married, lived in that for several years, and were able to leverage that into a family home. So we had both those properties. And subsequently put that investment property through the life cycle, sold that to the next people and bought another investment property, continued to build our equity and wealth through property in that regard. When I was starting to do that, it was certainly not an easy thing to do in my early 20s to commit to a mortgage. I'd done the research, I'd done the planning. I was confident that I was buying the right property in the right area that was going to fit my criteria for being a property investor. And it was hard. It was hard for my beautiful wife, who, as we watched so many of our friends either do the London thing for a couple of years or go and do these marvelous Kentucky tours or world tours. And that was just just simply not something we could afford to do because we were paying a mortgage. However, several decades on, that has certainly flipped, and we've been able to build wealth that has then allowed us to go and do this enormous amount of travel that so many people don't have the privilege to do in their 30s and 40s because they're just starting to take on the much bigger mortgage now. A number of friends talking about how lucky we were, privileged and special it was that we had that opportunity without really respecting that was a big commitment and risk that we took. We don't feel that we got to this position through luck. We made a conscious decision to do that and to go through the hard yards, and now we are reaping the rewards.
Coming back to Kate, you would have looked at her situation because she does say in the article, if somebody had said that she could have both, she would be so much better off. But she's finally, at 41, she's into the Sydney property market. I mean, 41 is not that old. Yes, if you're buying property at 21, it's double almost, but you do what you think is best. It's about creating the opportunity, and that is definitely exactly where you're at. Talk a little bit about the property in terms of what you bought. Read somewhere that it's risen by 276%, a gain of nearly $500,000.
I think that's the Brisbane unit market in the time since I bought in. What I really learned from that first experience and doing some minor renovations and selling that for a small profit was then a wonderful learning ground for the first house that we then bought with some land of our own. And that was a wonderful property investment success story. We negotiated well in buying that house, which was something that was perhaps a little easier to do in the mid-2000s. Put in the sweat equity. The three reasons I love property investment. It's the leverage. It's the fact that you can take on the debt, the other people's money, and to invest and gain off the back of that while inflation eats it away. It's the sweat equity that I can spend my weekends painting, building fences, adding value. Can't do that to BHP or Commonwealth Bank shares in the market. And then it's that personal edge you have of being able to do the research, buy the right property at the right time. We lived in that property for a few years, and then we started to travel to see the world, turned that into an investment property. With living there, we put something like $90,000 of our own cash into that house in Brisbane. When we sold it after tax, we had made almost $600,000 on that specific investment, which we were then able to use to completely pay off the family home so that was debt-free and to buy another property. And we now own a little bit of a compound in Brisbane. We've got two big properties next to each other on a corner block that we'll look to subdivide, knock down, rebuild one of the properties at some point and continue to invest in property and build the family wealth in that way.
Yeah, one of the comments that the experts say is one of the traps is analysis paralysis. This is failing to make any decision at all in your 20s. I do know a number of people when I was in my 20s, Jacob, that they couldn't decide what they wanted to do in terms of career, whether they wanted to have a family. They were really flailing all about. But yes, you make a clear decision that you want to buy property. It certainly is life-changing. And basically, you're just living off what you're generating off your properties that you've now got. It is a very nice situation to be in.
It absolutely is, and it's bigger than our wildest dreams. The last 5 years in particular, what property has done from a value creation, wealth creation perspective in Australia and Southeast Queensland has been far better than we ever could have forecast as a couple to allow us to do this. I do feel for people like Kate in that article and like some of our friends who had that analysis paralysis, who did feel that they weren't able to make a decision or they got caught up in some of those false beliefs. They had to have a 20% deposit, that paying mortgage insurance was a failure rather than committing and jumping in and doing it wisely. I'm not saying that everyone should just pay whatever for the first property. It can be exhausting when you're out there tomorrow doing the open home circuit or seeing another auction that goes for more than you were expecting, learning learning the market. The beautiful thing about property is that there is all of that data. You can do that research. You can find the right property that's going to set you up for the long term and commit to it. And I am a firm believer in the future of Australian real estate as an investment. Sitting around and waiting, watching properties get more and more expensive while you're on the sidelines because of fear to commit is just setting yourself up for more pain in the future, rather than those people like me, perhaps, who were able to feel confident in their decision early. And then you get on top of the mortgage, you get the pay rises, your career progresses, and then all of a sudden the mortgage is just a small part of your monthly outgoings, and you've got this home that has appreciated in value.
Yeah, Kate said that, the decision was in part shaped by watching her parents struggle with a mortgage, which kind of put her off in a lot of respects, I guess. I'm curious, what was the setup with your parents?
Somewhat similar, I think. I went off to boarding school as an early teenager, so I was not at home as much. And certainly talking to my parents now, they do acknowledge that they probably had opportunities to buy more real estate, to think a bit more about investments when they were younger. They did struggle. They struggled with some of the financial aspects of raising a young family and living their life. So I didn't come from a family that had a lot of money, had a lot of knowledge around how to build wealth. I was fortunate, though, to come from a family that, acknowledged that money was a conversation to have and to have openly, and not something to be feared or scared or hidden away. I learned about property actually through a book that one of the local real estate agents had given my father, as someone who was a man around town. I read that from cover to cover, didn't agree with all of it, but felt that I had an understanding. And I actually went to the extent where I took a job while I was at university in a real estate office to understand how the real estate market worked. Didn't pay me very much. I thought that I would get a return on investment when I did go to buy a property. And that, I think, helped give me that confidence to know that it wasn't some of those myths around a 20% deposit that I may have believed if I was just reading or hearing hearsay from friends. And that gave me the confidence to sit down with a mortgage broker and say, look, I don't think I can buy a property anytime soon. I'm making $34,000 a year, but tell me what I need to do to get there. And that was the point where he said, well, actually, you are fairly close. If you can do this and this with your expenses, then a bank will lend you a certain amount of money that you can use to get started. And that conversation was a life changer for me. Thank you, Joe, for having that conversation, taking that meeting with a young 21-year-old. That helped me realize that I could actually enter the property market before I thought I was able to. And I then had friends, still have some friends, who haven't bought their first property and haven't even had that conversation. And that conversation costs nothing in Australia, to meet with a broker to learn what you need to do. That's the power that you have to get that information and take the self-responsibility for getting into real estate, or for leveraging it into future investments if that's what you feel is best for your family.
Good stuff, Jacob. You're definitely on a winner with what you're doing. Thank you so much for sharing that story. There'll be a lot of younger listeners thinking, yes, this is the way to go. Need to get the property and then head off on my overseas experience. Great to talk, and thank you so much for telling your story, and enjoy your day there in Tunisia.
I will, and enjoy the rest of your day, and I hope everyone has a very successful weekend ahead.
Eager to expand your property expertise? Enhance your real estate know-how with us. We connect you to the best real estate information across Australia. The Real Estate Podcast.